Greetings. This is Amy Wentley with Chai Knuckles Knitting, and this is episode 2020-17, German Short Rows. This is the second in a series of 3 videos having to do with short rows. The first, episode 16, was Wrap and Turn. This one, episode 17, is German Short Rows, and the next one, episode 18, will be Japanese short rows. So let's jump into it. Just a reminder, short rows is a technique that involves stacking rows in the middle of a knitted piece of fabric to add extra coverage or to add shaping. Shaping is achieved by turning the work before you complete an entire row, and so that makes it a short row. So if you knit a full row, that would be a full row. In this case, you're going to knit up to a stitch and then turn in the middle of the work, so you'll be working a short row. An important concept to understand when we're talking about this is the pivot stitch. And the pivot stitch is the stitch around which we are going to turn our work. And depending on which method you're using, how you treat this pivot stitch is different. So for wrap and turn, this pivot stitch, we wrap it and then we turn. For German short row, what we're going to do is we're going to work up to that point. We're going to work the pivot stitch, and then we're going to turn, and then we are going to transform the pivot stitch into a double stitch, and I will show you how to do that. And in Japanese short rows, we do something else entirely different. We'll get to that in the next video. So with German short rows, the pros are that it is easy to do. The process stitches are less noticeable than a wrap and turn, and there's less distortion. A couple of the cons are that not as many patterns are written in German short rows as they are for wrap and turn, and the double stitch can be kind of confusing because what you do is you take one stitch and you transform it into what looks like 2 stitches, but you still treat it like one stitch. You only work it once. And so you can be confused, and you could possibly work that as 2 stitches, and then you would be increasing stitches, and that would, that gets a little confusing. So we'll talk about how to recognize those. There's a box on the paper here that talks about converting German to wrap and turn and converting German to Japanese. This will be in the description on the YouTube video, and it'll be on the blog. So if you ever come to a point where you have a pattern that's written for another method, you can convert to the method that you like best, which in my case is German short rows. So we'll get on to explaining that now. Okay, so when you do German short rows, what you're going to do is you're going to work up to and include the pivot stitch. So when we did wrap and turn, we worked up to the pivot stitch, and then we wrapped the pivot stitch and we turned. In this case, we're going to work up to and we're going to work the pivot stitch, then we're going to turn our work. We're going to slip 1 stitch from the left needle to the right needle as if to purl, and then we're going to yank up on that stitch to make it into a double stitch. We do a similar thing for the purl side, and I'll go over that at the time too. So the pattern that we're going to be using is this German short row pattern on the right. And let me just get these a little closer together for you so you can see that instruction on your left. Okay, so I have cast on 15 stitches and I purled to the end, and I am ready to start this row. I'm going to knit 10 and I'm going to turn, and I have a marker here on my pivot stitch. That's the 10th stitch. So I'm going to, actually I already worked 4 of these stitches, so there you go. So I knit 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I worked 9 stitches, and then I am going to also work the pivot stitch. So that's knit 10. Then I am going to turn my work. And this is how we're going to do a double stitch on this purl side. The yarn is in the front. It's important that your yarn be in front. We're going to move the stitch from the right needle, from the left needle to the right needle, And then we are going to take our working yarn and we are going to yank it over the top of the right needle. And do you see how I now have what looks like 2 stitches? And that's why we call it a double stitch. So it was 1 stitch like this here, and I just yanked the yarn up over the top to manipulate that stitch to make it look like 2. So that's our double stitch. Keep your eye on that. The double stitch will always be worked as 1 stitch. You'll work both of those legs together in 1 stitch. It won't be 2. Okay, so now I'm going to purl 4 and turn. So I bring my yarn to the front to purl, and I'll go ahead and do this English method for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I turn the work. And now I'm going to be doing a double stitch, and I'm going to bring my yarn to the front. I'm going to slip my yarn from the left needle to the right needle. Then I'm going to take my working yarn and I'm going to tug up on it again. And I'm going to make a double stitch. And there you go. That's what it looks like. Looks a little different than the other one. But it's still, you were taking 1 stitch here and we're pulling up both of those legs over the top of the needle to make something that looks like 2 stitches, but will be treated like 1. So I did the double stitch, and then the next instruction here says double stitch and then knit 5, processing the double stitch on the way. And what that means is I am going to knit 5 stitches here. And if you look at my needle, it's 1, 2, 3. This is my double stitch. That counts as 1. So that's 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when I get to that double stitch, I'm going to have to treat it a little differently. Okay, so I'm going to take my yarn to the, I've got my yarn in the back. There's my double stitch. And I'm going to knit 5. 1, 2, 3. Whoops. And there we go. 3. And then we get to the double stitch, which will be our 4th knit stitch. We're going to just simply knit the 2 legs of this double stitch together. So we insert our needle as if to do a knit 2 together, it feels like. And we're going to pull that through. And it's that simple. And then we're going to knit the 5th stitch and we're going to turn. And then the instructions say DS purl 6, processing a DS along the way. Okay, so let me do my DS first. So my yarn is in front. I'm going to slip my yarn from the left needle to the right needle. I'm going to yank it over the top to make a double stitch. And then I am going to purl 6, processing a double stitch along the way. So we've got, if you look at the needle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's our double stitch. That funky looking stitch there will be our 5th purl. And plus we'll do 1 more. So when we get to that double stitch, we're going to purl 1, 2, 3, 4. And here's our double stitch. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our right needle and we're going to put it under both of these legs of that stretch stitch and purl, sort of like a purl 2 together. And then we're going to work 1 more stitch, that's purl 6, and we're going to turn. I'll do this one more time for you, just so that you can really break it down. I'll go a little bit faster well, about the same speed, I guess. So I'm going to bring my yarn to the front to make this a double stitch. And I'm going to slip from the left needle to the right needle. And then I'm going to yank up on my working yarn to bring that double stitch over the right-hand needle. And I'm going to bring my yarn, leave my yarn in the back because I'm going to go ahead and knit 7 stitches and process that double stitch as I go. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, And here's the double stitch. I'm going to pretend like that's a knit two together and get those two legs in there and join those together. And then I'll do stitch 7, knit stitch 7, and then turn. And then one more time, my yarn is in the front. I'm going to slip from the left to the right, and I'm going to yank up on that yarn to make a double stitch, and I am going to purl 8, processing the double stitch along the way. So it's going to be purl 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 is going to have both of those legs of the double stitch together, and then 8. Now I'm going to pause for 1 minute, and I'm going to do the next couple of rows, and then we're going to come back and talk about how we end up. I'm going to work down to probably step 14 or 15. So just hang tight. I'll be right back. Welcome back. I am back. So I worked all the way to the end of step 13 here. And I want you to notice that when we go from 9 to 10, all of a sudden it quits saying processing the DS along the way. And that's because we're starting to decrease the number of stitches between our turns here. And when we go to knit 9, we actually don't come across a double stitch again that we have to deal with. And since we're going less and less and less, we're not running into those double stitches. And so we're going to start here on row 14, and I'll show you what that looks like. So this is row 14, and I'm supposed to double stitch, knit 5, and then turn. So to double stitch, I'm going to slip from the left to the right needle. My yarn's in front, and I'm going to yank it over the right needle, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to knit 5. And what happens is I'm not going to come up on a double stitch. There's no double stitches there to work. So that's 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to turn the work, and then I'm going to follow the next instruction that says double stitch, purl 4, and turn the work. So I'm going to slip the yarn from the left needle to the right needle, yank the yarn over the top, and then bring it back around again to do my purl stitches. And I'm going to do 4 purl stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I did not run into any double stitches that I had to process again that time either. Now what we're going to do is we're going to process all the double stitches. So we're at instruction 16 that says do a double stitch, knit to the end, processing the double stitches all along the way. So that means anywhere I hit a double stitch, I want to work it together. So if you look at my needle here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 plain stitches, and then I have 4 double stitches there that I work together, plus the 2 on the end. So let me go ahead and do that. The first one's going to be a double stitch. So my yarn has to be in front. I'm going to slip the yarn from the left to the right needle and yank it over the top to make that double stitch. And then I'm going to go ahead and knit this whole row to the end, working the double stitches as I go. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, double stitch, 1, 2, 3, and then here's my first double stitch. I'm going to knit both of those legs together like it's a knit 2 together. And here's my second double stitch. I'm going to do that. Here's my third double stitch. This is my last double stitch. And then I just knit the last 2 stitches in the row. And then the last instruction says purl to the end, processing double stitches on the way. So I turn my work. I'm going to purl to the end and process double stitches. So if you look at the stitches on my needle, there aren't any double stitches here because I just worked those when I was coming to the end of the row here. Here are my double stitches that I'm going to be dealing with this time. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to treat those like I'm purling 2 together, the 2 legs of each of those double stitches. So here we go. 1, sorry, my hands are a little sweaty, so my stitches aren't sliding easy. It's a little annoying. So that's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then we're going to start processing those double stitches. So here's one plain one still. And now we're into the doubles. Okay. So this double stitch, I'm going to pretend to purl 2 together. And this double stitch, put the needle under both legs and purl. Next one, put the needle under both legs and purl. Put the needle under both legs and purl. And I'm left with 2 stitches. And we're done. And the way we want to end this up then is that we want to just knit a whole row across, and then we'll bind off in pattern, and we'll be done with this sample. So please join me for the next episode in this series on Japanese short rows, and that's episode 2018. We'll see you there. Bye-bye.